Oh, hello. I just got to the good part. Well, now that you're here, let's begin. Back with chapter 3. Today's guest on Mr. Ward's virtual, sophisticated English language 11th grade class is my good friend Kyle, who is a recruiter for the U.S. Army. Say hello, Kyle.
Hello, students.
Let's begin. Chapter 3. There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. And so Kyle a second ago was pointing out how he's comparing these people to moths that are just like attracted to something, right? Just like Gatsby's attracted to Daisy, which we'll get to later on, and how these people are just kind of like mindlessly attracted to things that are like pretty and nice, kind of like implying that they don't have like a whole lot going on up there. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach while his two motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. Now, we looked up what cataracts of foam means, and we can't actually quite figure it out. So bonus points if you figure it out. 1,000 imaginary points.
Shoot books.
Yep. On weekends, his Rolls Royce became an omnibus bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagons scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. Again, yellow is going to come up over and over again. And I'm curious to see what you guys think the reason is, what he's trying to say it symbolizes. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before. Now I was reflecting on how I forgot to mention yesterday in chapter 2 how Wilson, Myrtle's husband, is the first worker who we encounter who is following the American dream of having a job and having a business and trying to make something of himself. And the first example of that is this guy who has been like beaten down by life and has become literally described as like a ghost who's not there, right? So this idea that the American dream has taken all of his being from him. And so Fitzgerald is talking about whether the American dream is like alive and well or dead in America. I think it's clear to say that Wilson's character is a clear example of his argument that the American dream is very much dead and cannot be achieved, and is doing, in fact, damage to people, right? And we talked about how the Valley of Ashes are like the byproducts of the American dream, the byproducts of these people who are trying to just amass wealth and spend it frivolously. And then again, here we have servants and gardeners. So again, we've got people who actually have jobs, unlike Gatsby and unlike Tom and Daisy, right? And these gardeners are doing what? And these servants are doing what? They're literally fixing the things that have been broken by all these rich people, right? So these people who have money, all they're doing is breaking things. They're creating like byproducts and damage. And the only jobs that these people have are to like fix these things and to make them look good again. Side note, I like that he has an extra gardener. All right. Every Friday, 5 crates of oranges and lemons arrived from a fruitier in New York. Every Monday, these same oranges and lemons left his back door in a pyramid of pulpless halves. There was a machine in the kitchen which could extract the juice of 200 oranges in half an hour, if a little button was pressed 200 times by a butler's thumb. And so here again, we've got this idea of another person who has a job in America. And what is his job? He's basically a machine. And he's just repeating the same action over and over again. And we've also got this idea of they take literally fruit of the earth, as Kyle pointed out a second ago, and do they eat it and kind of like take in all of its nutrients? No, all they do is cut it in half, take the really good juice from it, and then throw the rest out, right? So it's almost like they're taking out the essential part that makes a fruit, and then they just throw out the rest of the stuff that could be eaten and could be used and could be good. But again, they're just creating like byproduct and mess and garbage from their kind of like excessive lifestyle. At least once a fortnight, a corps of caterers came down with several hundred feet of canvas and enough colored lights to make a Christmas tree of Gatsby's enormous garden. On buffet tables, garnished with glistering hors d'oeuvres, spiced baked hams crowded against salads of harlequin designs and pastry pigs and turkeys bewitched to a dark gold. Bewitched, I love that. It's like the turkey would not normally be that color, but they're like trying to make it look really good. Like if you buy salmon and it's like been colored, like the salmon I bought yesterday at Costco, it says colored pink afterwards. to look good, right? Because remember, all that we care about in Great Gatsby is we want things that look good. We don't care if it's actually good. We just want people to think that we have money and think that we are valuable. In the main hall, a bar with a real brass rail, again, right? We want something that looks good, a real brass rail, not a fake one, was set up and stocked with gins and liquors and cordials, so long forgotten that most of his female guests were too young to know one from another. Cordials are just other liqueurs, right? So that they don't even like kind of know what they're drinking or what these things are. By 7 o'clock, the orchestra had arrived. No thin 5-piece affair, but a whole pitful of oboes and trombones and saxophones and viols and cornets and piccolos and low and high drums. I was pointing out to Kyle a second ago when we were looking at this that Fitzgerald chooses these kind of like weird instruments that you would only know if you like were slightly familiar with symphonies, and you would also only have these instruments in a very thick and well employed symphony, right? You only have an oboe if you've got like a ton of instruments, right? So he's really like saying that these are this is a very big symphony, no expense spared, as what's his face would say from Jurassic Park. The last swimmers have come in from the beach now and are dressing upstairs. The cars from New York are packed 5 deep in the drive, and already the halls and saloons and verandas are gaudy with primary colors and hair shorn in strange new ways and shawls beyond the dreams of Castile. The bar is in full swing, and floating rounds of cocktails permeate the garden outside until the air is alive with chatter and laughter and casual innuendo and introductions forgotten on the spot and enthusiastic meetings between women who never knew each other's names. And so we've got, again, this image of people who are having kind of like meaningless encounters with one another, where they forget everything, they don't even know who each other are, right? And you guys have seen this when someone like meets someone and they're like super excited because they're at a party, and they kind of want to appear to be like known by others, but they don't actually know who these people are. And as you pointed out a second ago, right? What is it?
So this is what people do. You had mentioned it in the first chapter, when Daisy says, "What do people do?" This is what people do, but it's...
Like rich people.
Yeah.
It's the idea of what rich people do.
Exactly.
Like in movies and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
In chapter 1, that's what actual rich people do.
That's what she's talking about, or whatever. What do people do? This is what people do, or what people think that they do.
Yeah, so like chapter 1 is what rich people actually do, which is kind of like nothing. Mm-hmm. And then what Gatsby is doing is he's trying to appear rich. So he's like putting on like a show of sorts, right?
Right.
Yeah. The lights grow brighter as the earth lurches away from the sun, and now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music, again yellow, and the opera of voices pitches a key higher. Laughter is easier, minute by minute, spilled with prodigality, I don't know what that means, tipped out at a cheerful word. The groups change more swiftly, swell with new arrivals, dissolve and form in the same breath. Already there are wanderers, confident girls who weave here and there among the shouter and more stable, become for a sharp, joyous moment the center of a group, and then excited with triumph glide on through the sea change of faces and voices and color under the constantly changing light. So you've got Fitzgerald who kind of creates this like this image of like almost like an organism that's just kind of like moving and changing and constantly just kind of just in flux. It's not thinking. It's not trying to do anything specific. It's just kind of like a blob that's moving around.
The spirit of the party.
The spirit of the party. So that is the spirit of the party. I like
Prodigality is extravagance and spending.
Extravagance and spending. I would love to be able to prodigality my life. Prodigalitally spend my money. Prodigalitally spend my time. All right. Suddenly, one of these gypsies in trembling opal seizes a cocktail out of the air, dumps it down for courage, and moving her hand like Frisco, dances out alone on the canvas platform. A momentary hush. The orchestra leader varies his rhythm obligingly for her, and there is a burst of chatter as the enormous news goes around that she is Gilda Gray's understudy from The Follies. The party has begun. And so now we know the party only begins when not the star, so The Follies would reference a play on Broadway. So not the star Gilda Gray shows up, but her understudy, right? Like the second best person. So again, we've got this idea that Gatsby is not quite the rich person he wants to be, right? He's only got the understudy there. I believe that on the first night I went to Gatsby's house, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited. They went there. They got into automobiles, which bore them out to Long Island, and somehow they ended up at Gatsby's door. Once there, they were introduced by somebody who knew Gatsby, and after that, they conducted themselves according to the rules of behavior associated with amusement parks. Sometimes they came and went without having met Gatsby at all, came for the party with a simplicity of heart that was its own ticket of admission. So this comparison of Gatsby's parties to like an amusement park, right? This idea of like he is trying to entertain them. He is not trying to do what you usually do with a party, which is like have like a meaningful social gathering with like your friends, right? He is clearly trying to amuse people, put on a show. That's what Gatsby is doing. Did I finish that sentence?
Yeah, you finished the paragraph.
All right.
Can I?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I think there's a why to that, right? I guess that's what you should be looking for. Like, why is he having these parties?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're thinking about right now? Mm-hmm. And I guess the crash course, did they explain that?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And the answer is Daisy.
Daisy.
He wants Daisy to show up.
He's trying to show Daisy how rich he is.
Right, and he wants her to, because like it's cooler, right? It's way cooler if like she shows up to his party than if he invites her, mm-hmm. right? It's way cooler, right? And that's what he wants. He wants to be cool. And to be honest, Gatsby is cool. I had been actually invited. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that. Doesn't he live next to Gatsby?
Next door, yeah.
So why did he send a chauffeur? Excellent. Remember, we're looking at like waste, right? Waste and byproduct, and this is all waste. A chauffeur in a uniform of robin's egg blue crossed my lawn early that Saturday morning with a surprisingly formal note from his employer. The honor would be entirely Gatsby's, it said, if I would attend his little party that night. He had seen me several times and had intended to call on me long before, but a peculiar combination of circumstances had prevented it. Signed, J. Gatsby, in a majestic hand. Dressed up in white flannels, I went over to his lawn a little after 7 and wandered around rather ill at ease among swirls and eddies of people I didn't know. Side note, I'm wondering if he's in white flannel because A, he's kind of a weirdo, and B, he's still kind of like, he's still kind of innocent, right? Like at the end of all of this, he becomes much more like disillusioned with people.
Yeah, he's like using the color white to describe who he is in the story, the innocent one.
Mm-hmm, yep. Though here and there was a face I had noticed on the commuting train. I was immediately struck by the number of young Englishmen dotted about, all well-dressed, all looking a little hungry, and all talking in low, earnest voices to solid and prosperous Americans. I was sure that they were selling something, bonds or insurance or automobiles. So bonds are loans from companies or the government that people buy and get a little bit of an interest on. They get like 3% back on that. Insurance, and then automobiles. It's just interesting. It's an interesting group. It's almost like not real things until you get to cars, right? Bonds are not really real. Insurance is not really real. Cars are real. But in New York City, you don't need a car. So these are all kind of 3 things that aren't either real or really that valuable from like a necessity to live standpoint. They were at last agonizingly aware of the easy money in the vicinity and convinced that it was theirs for a few words in the right key. And so now we've got this image of Fitzgerald continually painting um, the American dream and American business and people as not honest and straightforward and trying to sell you something to improve your life, but they are parasites trying to just like pull the valuable things from you. They're the machine that's squeezing the fruit, that's trying to get all the juice out of you and then throw you to the curb.
Throw the pulp out.
Throw the pulp out. You are the pulp. As soon as I arrived, I made an attempt to find my host, but the 2 or 3 people of whom I asked his whereabouts stared at me in such an amazed way and denied so vehemently any knowledge of his movements that I slunk off in the direction of the cocktail table, the only place in the garden where a single man could linger without looking purposeless and alone. I love that he asked where Gatsby was, and they were like offended by his question. Like, who would ever ask where the host of a party was? Not us. I was on my way to get roaring drunk. Oh no, remember what happened last chapter when he got roaring drunk? I was on my way to get roaring drunk from sheer embarrassment when Jordan Baker came out of the house and stood at the head of the marble steps, leaning a little backward and looking with contemptuous interest down into the garden. Welcome or not, I found it necessary to attach myself to someone before I should begin to address cordial remarks to the passers-by. Hello, I roared, advancing toward her. My voice seemed unnaturally loud across the garden. I thought you might be here, she responded, absently, as I came up. I love that she absently responded. Jordan Baker's not really in. She doesn't live a real life. I remember you lived next door. She held my hand impersonally. Again, right? She's not real. As a promise that she'd take care of me in a minute, and gave ear to 2 girls in twin yellow dresses who stopped at the foot of the steps. Hello, they cried together. Sorry you didn't win. That was for the golf tournament. She had lost in the finals the week before. You don't know who we are, said one of the girls in the yellow. But we met you here about a month ago. You've dyed your hair since then, remarked Jordan. And I started, but the girls had moved casually on, and her remark was addressed to the premature moon, produced like the supper, no doubt, out of the caterer's basket. So I love that she was like talking to them, and they just kind of like left and walked away, right? Because like in this place, the American dream, money is spent in meaningless ways, just like that was a meaningless conversation. With Jordan's slender golden arm resting in mine, we descended the steps and sauntered about the garden. A tray of cocktails floated at us through the twilight, and we sat down at a table, and the 2 girls in yellow and 3 men, each one introduced to us as Mr. Mumble. Do you come to these parties often? Inquired Jordan of the girl beside her. The last one was the one I met you at, answered the girl, in an alert, confident voice. She turned to her companion. Wasn't it for you, Lucille? It was for Lucille, too. I like to come, Lucille said. I never care what I do, so I always have a good time. When I was... I don't care what I do, so I always have a good time. No goals, no aspiration, just... I don't care about anything because I have so much money. I don't have problems that I have to deal with. I can pay people to deal with my problems. I advise that you never care what you are going to do, so you always have a good time. That sounds like a good life philosophy. When I was here last, I tore my gown on a chair, and he asked me my name and address. Inside of a week, I got a package from Courier's with a new evening gown in it. Did you keep it? Asked Jordan. Sure I did. I was going to wear it tonight, but it was too big in the bust and had to be altered. It was gas blue with lavender heads, $265. Gas blue is not the color you would want your things to be, probably. Gas blue. You would want it to be like aqua, right? You want something that's like naturally, that's sounds of nature, not of machine and society. And who sent her that dress? Gatsby did. Because this establishes what about him? That he's a nice person? I guess, kind of, right? That's like a nice thing to do. Or it's a cool thing to do, right? Yeah. Really, it's a cool thing to do. There's something funny about a fellow that'll do a thing like that, said the other girl eagerly. He doesn't want any trouble with anybody. Who doesn't? I inquired. Gatsby, somebody told me, right? He doesn't even know who these people are or who's talking. The 2 girls and Jordan leaned together confidently. Somebody told me they thought he killed a man once. A thrill passed over all of us. The 3 Mr. Mumbles bent forward and listened eagerly. I don't think it's so much that, argued Lucille skeptically. It's more that he was a German spy during the war. Right? These are very cool stories
Cool,
to have people tell about you, right? One of the men nodded in confirmation. I heard that from a man who knew all about him, grew up with him in Germany, he assured us positively. Oh, no, said the first girl. It couldn't be that, because he was in the American army during the war. As our credulity switched back to her, she leaned forward with enthusiasm. You look at him sometime when he thinks nobody's looking at him. I'll bet he killed a man. She narrowed her eyes and shivered. Lucille shivered. We all turned and looked around for Gatsby. It was testimony to the romantic speculation he inspired that there were whispers about him from those who found little that it was necessary to whisper about in this world. I love it. And, his goal is being accomplished because what does he want? He wants, all these rumors to come back to Daisy. Mm-hmm. The first supper, note, mini suppers. The first supper, there would be another one after midnight, was now being served, and Jordan invited me to join her own party, who were spread around a table on the other side of the garden. There were 3 married couples and Jordan's escort, a persistent undergraduate given to violent innuendo and obviously under the impression that sooner or later Jordan was going to yield him up, her person, to a greater or lesser degree. So we've got her date is like an idiot who's convinced at some point Jordan's going to become his girl. Instead of rambling, this party had preserved a dignified homogeneity and assumed it to itself the function of representing the stable nobility of the countryside. East Egg, condescending to West Egg, and carefully on guard against its spectroscopic gaiety. Whoa, a lot said there. I feel like Fitzgerald was trying to impress his wife, Zelda Fitzgerald, with all of his big words.
He's trying to Gatsby her?
Oh, yeah, he's trying to Gatsby her. Yeah, he's trying to seem cool. Zelda Fitzgerald was also an artist, and she was a bit crazy, unfortunately, and Fitzgerald had to spend a lot of his fortune and money that he made writing to put her into and out of insane asylums.
Oh, I did not.
So, yeah, sad day. Side note, I highly recommend watching Midnight in Paris. Have you seen Midnight in Paris?
I have not.
Oh, it's a great movie. Great movie. Hello. Let's get out, whispered Jordan after a somehow wasteful and inappropriate half hour. This is much too polite for me. We got up and she explained that we were going to find the host. I had never met him, she said, and it was making me uneasy. The undergraduate nodded in a cynical, melancholy way. The bar, where we glanced first, was crowded, but Gatsby was not there. She couldn't find him from the top of the steps, and he wasn't on the veranda. On a chance, we tried an important-looking door and walked into a high Gothic library, paneled with carved English oak and probably transported complete from some ruin overseas. So, of course, he has a library. Why? Why does anyone have a library? Why would you ever keep a bunch of books in your house? Is it because you want to reread them? Or because you want people to see all the books that you've read?
Many leather-bound books.
Many leather-bound books never opened. A stout, middle-aged man with enormous owl-eyed spectacles was sitting somewhat drunk on the edge of a great table, staring with unsteady concentration at the shelves of books. As we entered, he wheeled excitedly around and examined Jordan from head to foot. What do you think? He demanded impetuously. About what? He waved his hand toward the bookshelves. About that. As a matter of fact, you needn't bother to ascertain. I ascertain. They're real. The books? He nodded. Absolutely real. Have pages and everything. I thought they'd be nice, durable cardboard. Matter of fact, they're absolutely real. Pages, and here, let me show you. Taking our skepticism for granted, he rushed to the bookcase and returned with Volume 1 of the Stoddard Lectures. See? He cried triumphantly. It's a bona fide piece of printed matter. It fooled me. This fellow's a regular Velasco. It's a triumph. What thoroughness, what realism. Knew when to stop, too. Didn't cut the pages. But what do you want? What do you expect? He snatched the book from me and replaced it hastily on its shelf, muttering that if one brick was removed, the whole library was liable to collapse. Who brought you? He demanded. Or did you just come? I was brought. Most people were brought. Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. So I love that this guy was also skeptical, right? He was like, these books aren't real. These are fake books. And then he pulled them down. He's like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
These are real books. But note that what does he pull out? He pulls out the Stoddard lectures, right? So are these like, would anybody ever read the Stoddard lectures? Unlikely.
So to me, it's like he's the only guy that's there that's like, what the heck is all of this? And he thinks that it's fake, and everyone else is just there to party, and he's the only one that's like,
That's a good point. He's the one of the few people that actually questions whether this is all real.
Yeah, like what's going on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But then, does he read the books?
No, he doesn't read the books, just like Gatsby doesn't read the books.
No, he's just like, look, they're books. I'm fascinated.
So is that an accident that he pulled that particular book, or do you think that was on purpose?
I think that was on purpose. I think that Fitzgerald wants to show that this guy has a library full of like kind of like meaningless books. Like a library should be a reflection of the things that you have read, to kind of show what you've not read yet. So you can be like, yeah, these are things I might have to like return to them to like reread a section or to like relearn something, right? But he's filling it with books like the Stoddard lectures, which would indicate that these are books that no one would ever open, right? Like if it was supposed to be a library full of like meaningful works, he would have pulled down Hamlet or what would be another great piece of literature that would be from back in this time?
Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. He would pull down some great piece of literature, but he pulls down not just the Stoddard lectures. He pulls down volume 1 of 12, I assume, of the Stoddard lectures.
So then, didn't cut the pages means he didn't dog-ear it, right? Like as a bookmark.
I don't know.
I think he
is that what he means
too, because obviously the book's never been opened
or
used, and he missed the fact that it's a real book, but no one's reading it.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, you're right.
I think that's what that means.
I think you're right. Yeah, that no one has ever read it because all the pages are perfectly made. Yep, there you go.
He knew just when to stop, so he excuses him from it.
That's funny.
Rather than thinking about it, like.
And remember, again, this whole thing is Fitzgerald, who in this. Fitzgerald would kind of be in like the Nick Carraway camp in life, where he would be invited to a lot of like nice things, but he would not necessarily himself be rich. And so this is partly him insulting a lot of people that he's been around because he's been to a lot of these parties where he's like, oh my God, you are in front of me. You have way more money than me. You have way more money than most people, and you are like the equivalent of a vase of flowers. That's what you are as a person. You are a vase of flowers, and you have to have your water changed on occasion, and that's the extent of your personality.
Yeah.
Right. All right.
I never noticed that before.
Never try and be described to others as a vase of flowers. Jordan looked at him alertly, cheerfully, without answering. I was brought by a woman named Roosevelt, he continued. Mrs. Cloud Roosevelt. Do you know her? I met her somewhere last night. He doesn't even know where. I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in a library. Has it? A little bit, I think. I can't tell yet. I've only been here an hour. Did I tell you about the books? They're real. You told us. We shook hands with him gravely and went back outdoors. They were dancing now on the canvas in the garden. Old men pushing young girls backwards in eternal graceless circles. Notice that all the women are simply described as young girls, right? Because do rich men want to hang out with 45-year-old women? No, they don't. Because they don't care about relationships, right? They care about flashiness. They care about being satiated in the moment and feeling good in the moment, right? Like drugs.
Well, they're using the women too, right?
Exactly.
For children.
That too. Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
And throwing out when they get old.
Yeah, absolutely. Because
fresh fruit tomorrow.
Like who's the guy who owns Fox News? He's like 89. His birthday party was just canceled because of coronavirus.
I don't know.
You don't know the guy who owns Fox News? I think he's been married like 6 times, and his current wife is like 40, and he's 89. Yeah, check it out. There was dancing now in the canvas garden, old men pushing young girls backwards in eternal graceless circles, superior couples holding each other tortuously, fashionably, and keeping in the corners. and a great number of single girls dancing individualistically or relieving the orchestra for a moment of the burden of the banjo or traps. So they're like going into the orchestra and borrowing instruments. by, by midnight, the hilarity had increased. A celebrated tenor had sung in Italian, and a notorious contralto had sung in jazz, and between the numbers, people were doing stunts all over the garden, while happy vacuous bursts of laughter all over the garden, while happy vacuous bursts of laughter rose toward the summer sky. A pair of stage twins, who turned out to be the girls in yellow, did a baby act in costume, and champagne was served in glasses bigger than finger bowls. The moon had risen higher, and floating in the sound was a triangle of silver scales, trembling a little to the stiff, tiny drip of the banjos on the lawn. I was still with Jordan Baker. We were sitting at the table with a man of about my age and a rowdy little girl who gave way upon the slightest provocation to uncontrollable laughter. I was enjoying myself now. I had taken 2 finger bowls of champagne, and the scene had changed before my eyes into something significant, elemental, and profound. So we've got Nick, who only kind of starts to enjoy himself at the party when he has taken his drug, and now he can kind of like blend in with things. He's had his 2 finger bowls of champagne, which would probably be like 4 glasses of champagne. So for Nick, who seems like a lightweight, he would be pretty sloshed at this point. At a lull in the entertainment, the man looked at me and smiled. "Your face is familiar," he said politely. "Weren't you in the 3rd Division during the war?" "Why, yes. I was in the 9th Machine Gun Battalion. I was in the 7th Infantry until June 1918. I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." We talked for a moment about some wet gray little villages in France. Evidently, he lived in this vicinity, for he told me that he had just bought a hydroplane and was going to try it out in the morning. "Want to go with me, old sport? Just near the shore along the Sound." "What time?" "Any time that suits you best." It was on the tip of my tongue to ask his name when Jordan looked around and smiled. "Having a gay time now?" she inquired. "Much better." I turned again to my new acquaintance. "This is an unusual party for me. I haven't even seen the host. I live over there." I waved my hand at the invisible hedge in the distance, and this man Gatsby sent over his chauffeur with an invitation. For a moment, he looked at me as if he failed to understand. "I'm Gatsby," he said suddenly. "What?" I explained. "Oh, I beg your pardon." "I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host." He smiled understandingly. Much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles, with a quality of eternal reassurance in it, that you may come across 4 or 5 times in life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you, with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hoped to convey. Precisely, at that point, it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant young roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Sometime before he introduced himself, I'd got a strong impression that he was picking his words with care. And so now we've got Gatsby, who is the kind of person that makes you feel like a better version of yourself.
Something I wanted to comment on being in the army is like he's at this party where nothing's really happening, but it's like a rager, but no one's really connecting, no one's really talking.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first person that he connects with is a guy that he like trades war stories with, which is like exactly what we would do, like soldiers and stuff.
Yeah.
And he feels so out of place, and now he finds this guy that's, this guy's just like me. He's like, he's cool. And then it turns out to be Gatsby.
Yeah. And the thing that connects them is brotherhood, like shared experience,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And the people at the party have the exact opposite of shared experience. They have no connection with each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the only real thing, and war is a real thing, something that they have actually done that takes work and has some level of accomplishment, as opposed to just going to parties and hanging out all day. Almost at the moment when Gatsby identified himself, a butler hurried toward him with the information that Chicago was calling him on the wire. He excused himself with a small bow that included each of us in turn. "If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport." he urged me. Excuse me, I will rejoin you later. Side note: Nick also describes Nick also describes Gatsby as sounding almost like absurdly rich. Right?
Hmm.
A second ago, he says, "Whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd." That was the goal of my first and my second introduction videos, was to have a speech pattern that bordered or definitely fell into the level of absurd formality. He excused himself. If you want anything, just ask for it, old sport, he urged. Excuse me, I'll rejoin you later. When he was gone, I turned immediately to Jordan, constrained to assure her of my surprise. I had expected that Mr. Gatsby would be a florid and corpulent person in his middle years. Who is he? I demanded. Do you know? He's just a man named Gatsby. Where is he from? I mean, and what does he do? Now you're started on the subject, she answered with a wan smile. Well, he told me once he was an Oxford man. A dim background started to take shape behind him, but at her next remark it faded away. However, I don't believe it. Why not? I don't know, she insisted. I just don't think he went there. Something in her tone. Oxford is like the place, if you were in England, you want to go to college. I think like every prime minister in England has gone to Oxford.
Really?
I feel like that is. I feel like this guess I'm making that sounds like a fact may be a partial fact.
Is that the club?
Oxford University.
Yeah.
That's the club you have to belong to. Kyle is fact checking me. A dim background started to take shape. Something in her tone reminded me of the other girls. I think he killed a man, and had the effect of stimulating my curiosity. I would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or from the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible, but young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience, I believed they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island. Did you find any information?
Exactly 75%.
75%?
28 of 35.
Wow.
35 doesn't sound like enough.
28 of 35?
In the United Kingdom?
In the UK? Well, prime ministers have not been around for that long.
Okay, I thought it was for a long time.
No. So yeah, that's a lot have come from one place, Oxford. Interesting though that Nick is like, I could just see him coming from like the swamps of Louisiana.
He's just some guy, right? He knows.
Yeah, he knows, but then also that it's the young aspect of him. Like, how did this guy get money if we were both in the war together?
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, he gives large parties, said Jordan, changing the subject with an urbane distaste for the concrete. And I like large parties. They're so intimate. At small parties, there isn't any privacy. It's so weird to say.
That's contradicting.
Exactly, right? It's like totally wrong, right? It's like she's looking for either the wrong things at parties or she's just an idiot.
It's the idea, right?
The idea?
Like this big ornate party is real to her.
Yeah.
Versus the connection with people.
That's true. Yeah, very much so. So Jordan doesn't feel like like one-on-one conversations are real. The only thing that's real is when things are like flashy and big.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was a boom of a bass drum, and the voice of the orchestra leader rang out suddenly above the echolalia of the garden. Damn you, Fitzgerald. Ladies and gentlemen, he cried, at the request of Mr. Gatsby, we are going to play for you Mr. Vladimir Tostof's latest work, which attracted so much attention at Carnegie Hall last May. If you read the papers, you know there was a big sensation. He smiled with jovial condescension and added, some sensation, whereupon everybody laughed. The piece is known, he concluded lustily, as Vladimir Tostof's Jazz History of the World. What are you laughing at?
It's just so like
pompous?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes it is.
He'd like to play this special tribute to...
Yes. You've read about it in papers, yes. Yes. Well, because you're here, you get to taste the culture. The nature of Mr. Tostof's composition eluded me, because just as it began, my eyes fell on Gatsby standing alone on the marble steps and looking from one group to another with approving eyes. His tan skin was drawn attractively tight on his face, and his short hair looked as though it were trimmed every day. I could see nothing sinister about him. I wondered if the fact that he was not drinking helped to set him off from his guests, for it seemed to me that he grew more correct as the fraternal hilarity increased. When the jazz history of the world was over, girls were putting their heads on men's shoulders in puppyish, convivial way. Girls were swooning backward playfully into men's arms, even into groups, knowing that someone would arrest their falls. But no one swooned backward on Gatsby, and no French bob touched Gatsby's shoulder, and no singing quartets were formed with Gatsby's head for one link. And so now we've got the image of Gatsby's life, which is that he is alone, and he is just, it's almost like he's the conductor, and this is all his like symphony, right? Mm-hmm. He has brought them all together to like play their parts.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Like, it's almost like he knew when he played the jazz history of the world what was about to happen.
Very much so. I beg your pardon. Gatsby's butler was suddenly standing beside us. Miss Baker, he inquired. I beg your pardon, but Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone. With me? She exclaimed in surprise. Yes, madame. She got up slowly, raising her eyebrows at me in astonishment, and followed the butler toward the house. Notice that Gatsby could have done what? Walked over to her, right? But he doesn't do that, right? He does the cool thing. He sends his man. I noticed that she wore her evening dress, all her dresses like sports clothes. There was a jauntiness about her movement as if she had learned to walk upon golf courses on clean, crisp mornings. I was alone, and it was almost 2. For some time, confused and intriguing sounds had issued from a long, many-windowed room which overhung the terrace, eluding Jordan's undergraduate, who was now engaged in an obstetrical conversation with 2 chorus girls, and who implored me to join him. I went inside. The large room was full of people. One of the girls in yellow was playing the piano, and beside her stood a tall, red-haired young lady from a famous chorus engaged in song. She had drunk a quantity of champagne, and during the course of her song she had decided ineptly that everything was very, very sad. Students, this sometimes happens to people when they imbibe in the alcohol or the champagne. They get very, very sad.
The pleasures of the liquor.
The pleasures of the liquor sometimes bring about great, great sadness.
The crying girl at the party.
Yep. She was not only singing, she was weeping too. Whenever there was a pause in the song, she filled it with gasping, broken sobs, and then took up the lyric again in a quavering soprano. The tears coursed down her cheeks, not freely, however, for when they came into contact with her heavily beaded eyelashes, they assumed an inky color and pursued the rest of their way in slow black rivulets. A humorous suggestion was made that she sing the notes on her face, whereupon she threw up her hands, sank into a chair, and went off into deep Venus sleep. So she's so sad and drunk, and her mascara is just like running down her face, and then she falls asleep in her chair.
That's a really funny joke too. You should sing the notes on your face because like the mascara made like something on her face.
That's
and,
funny.
You have music written because it's streaking. So it's like, what is that called? The sheets of music. Bars.
Yeah, but I mean, even a note would just have like a line that like goes down it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. And then
right?
It's a ball at the end.
Yeah. Oh, so each eye is a note because it has like the line going down it. Solid. I'm glad we worked our way through that imagery.
We unpacked that joke forever.
Yeah, I assume you're all laughing at this point. I think actually Kat's on her way home. I think we shall pause because I think I have cooking I need to get doing.
Start.
And we're back. All right. We left off at Venus sleep in the party. She had a fight with a man who says he's her husband, explaining a girl at my elbow. I looked around. Most of the remaining women were now having fights with men said to be their husbands. Even Jordan's party, the quartet from East Egg, were rent asunder by dissension. One of the men was talking with curious intensity to a young actress, and his wife, after attempting to laugh at the situation in a dignified and indifferent way, broke down entirely and resorted to flank attacks. At intervals, she appeared suddenly at his side like an angry diamond and hissed, "You promised!" into his ear. Now, some of you might not know what he promised, but clearly he promised to not have any more extramarital affairs. I also love the idea that she started to attack him on the flanks. The reluctance to go home was not confined to wayward men. The hall was at present occupied by two deplorably sober men and their highly indignant wives. The wives were sympathizing with each other in slightly raised voices. Whenever he sees I'm having a good time, he wants to go home. Never heard anything so selfish in my life. We're always the first ones to leave. So are we. Well, we're almost the last tonight, said one. Oh, well, we're almost the last tonight, said one of the men sheepishly. The orchestra left half an hour ago. In spite of the wives' agreement that such malevolence was beyond credibility, the dispute ended in a short struggle, and both wives were lifted, kicking into the night. Again, this is a very real, a very real situation that happens at
the end of parties.
At the ends of parties, when you're adults, at the ends of cocktail parties or late night parties, when some people who are sober especially have been like, I've been around these people for 5 hours now, I'd like to go home and sleep.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, oh, we always leave early. In spite of the wives, as I waited for my hat in the hall, the door of the library opened and Jordan Baker and Gatsby came out together. He was saying some last word to her, but the eagerness in his manner tightened abruptly into formality as several people approached him to say goodbye. Jordan's party were calling impatiently to her from the porch, but she lingered for a moment to shake hands. I just heard the most amazing thing, she whispered. How long were you in there? Or how long were we in there? Why, about an hour. It was simply amazing, she repeated abstractly, but I swore I wouldn't tell it, and here I am tantalizing you. Baker's very much a flirt, right? Very much a tease.
Yeah.
She yawned gracefully in my face. Please come and see me. Phone book under the name Mrs. Sorney Howard, my aunt. She was hurrying off as she talked. Her brown hand waved a jaunty salute as she melted into her party at the door. Rather ashamed that on my first appearance I had stayed so late, I joined the last of Gatsby's guests who were clustered around him. I wanted to explain that I had hunted for him early in the evening and to apologize for not having known him in the garden. Don't mention it, he ignored me eagerly. Don't give it another thought, old sport. The familiar expression held no more familiarity than the hand which reassuredly brushed my shoulder. And don't forget, we're going up in the hydroplane tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Then the butler, behind his shoulder. Philadelphia wants you on the phone, sir. All right, in a minute. Tell them I'll be right there. Good night. Good night. Good night, he smiled. And suddenly there seemed to be a pleasant significance in having been among the last to go, as if he had desired it all the time. Good night, old sport. Good night. But as I walked down the steps, I saw that the evening was not quite over. 50 feet from the door, a dozen headlights illuminated a bizarre and tumultuous scene. In the ditch beside the road, right side up, but violently shorn of one wheel, rested a new coupe, which had left Gatsby's drive not 2 minutes before. The sharp jut of a wall accounted for the detachment of the wheel, which was now getting considerable attention from half a dozen curious chauffeurs. However, as they had left their cars blocking the road, a harsh, discordant din from those in the rear had been audible for some time and added to the already violent confusion of the scene. So what did he do? He ran into the wall. Solid. A man in a long duster had dismounted from the wreck and now stood in the middle of the road, looking from the car to the tire and from the tire to the observers in a pleasant, puzzled way. See, he explained, it went in the ditch. The fact was infinitely astonishing to him, and I recognized first the unusual quality of wonder, and then the man. It was the late patron of Gatsby's library. How did it happen? He shrugged his shoulders. I know nothing whatever about mechanics, he said decisively. But how did it happen? Did you run into the wall? Don't ask me, said Owl Eyes, washing his hands of the whole matter. I know very little about driving. Next to nothing. It happened. That's all I know. Well, if you're a poor driver, you oughtn't to try driving at night. But I wasn't even trying, he explained indignantly. I wasn't even trying. I don't even quite know why that's so funny. He's just so oblivious to the world and life. Which is funny because he was so into details just moments early in the library.
Yeah. Well, he's been drunk for a week. I think he's
Oh,
more
that's
drunk
right.
now. Yeah. So,
That's right. He's been drunk for a week.
so maybe in the library he was like, when you get older, you'll understand this. At that point where it's like you're like feeling really.
People are, as we've observed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now
Yes.
he's over the edge where he's stupid instead of observant.
Although he was stupid in the library too. Maybe he's just continuing to be stupid. An odd hush fell upon the bystanders. Do you want to commit suicide? You're lucky it was just a wheel, a bad driver, and not even trying. You don't understand, explained the criminal. I wasn't driving. There's another man in the car. The shock that followed this declaration found voice in the sustained "ah" as the door of the coupe swung slowly open. The crowd, it was now a crowd, stepped back involuntarily, and when the door had opened wide, there was a ghostly pause. Then, very gradually, part by part, a pale, dangling individual stepped out of the wreck, pawing tentatively at the ground with large, uncertain dancing shoes. Blinded by the glare of the headlights and confused by the incessant groaning of the horns, the apparition stood swaying for a moment before he perceived the man in the duster. What's the matter? He inquired calmly. Did we run out of gas? Look! Half a dozen fingers pointed at the amputated wheel. He stared at it for a moment and then looked upward as though he suspected that it had dropped from the sky. It came off, someone explained. He nodded. At first I didn't notice we'd stopped. A pause. Then, taking a long breath and straightening his shoulders, he remarked in a determined voice, Wonder if tell me where there's a gas line station? So again, we've got this guy who's like he's so drunk and he's so out of touch with reality that he has no idea what's happening to him. And he came out of his car, which was the car upside down?
No,
Or
so
it's just in the ditch.
It's in the ditch, so it's leaning. I like that part too, where it's like it Paul, like he's like trying to find his footing on the ground.
Oh, that's what
and then
it
he's
is.
like, I didn't even realize we'd stopped, but he could barely get out of his car. Like that's how bad of a wreck that he's in.
And they're like literally in a ditch, and the car is angled downwards. And he's like, "Oh, we must have run out of gas. That's what happens
and
to
people
cars."
are trying to explain to him what's going on, and he was the one driving. He doesn't know where he's at.
Oh God. At least a dozen men, some of them little better off than he was, explained to him that the wheel and the car were no longer joined by any physical bond. Back out, he suggested after a moment. Put her in reverse. But the wheel's off, he hesitated. No harm in trying, he said. The caterwauling horns had reached a crescendo, and I turned away and cut across the lawn toward home. I glanced back once. A wafer of a moon was shining over Gatsby's house, making the night fine as before and surviving the laughter and the sound of his still glowing garden. A sudden emptiness seemed to flow now from the windows and the great doors, endowing with complete isolation the figure of the host who stood on the porch, his hand up in a formal gesture of farewell. Again, we've got the image of Gatsby alone. Reading over what I have written so far, I see I have given the impression that the event of 3 nights, that the events of 3 nights, several weeks apart, were all that absorbed me. On the contrary, they were merely casual events in a crowded summer, and, until much later, they absorbed me infinitely less than my personal affairs. Most of the time, I worked. In the early mornings, the sun threw my shadow westward as I hurried down the white chasm of lower New York to the Probity Trust. That's probably the name of the company that he works for. I knew the other clerks and young bond salesmen by their first names and lunched with them in dark, crowded restaurants on little pig sausages and mashed potatoes and coffee. I even had a short affair with a girl who lived in Jersey City and worked in the accounting department, but her brother began throwing mean looks in my direction, so when she went on her vacation in July, I let it blow quietly away. Again, we've got Nick, the passive person, right? He doesn't break it off with her. He just kind of like ghosts her.
Yeah, just lets it blow away.
Also, we have the second person who's a major character who actually has a job, and that's Nick, right? So now we've got him actually working and trying to kind of achieve the American dream. But is he selling anything that's like real? Not really. He's selling bonds. He's selling they're like promises that the government or company will pay you back in the future with a little bit of interest on it. So if you bought like a bond for $100, it was probably at like a 2% interest rate, then that means the government is saying, okay, in 10 years, I promise to give you $102 back. Or actually, it would be compounded interest. So it would be like $20 back. And so that's basically what he's selling, is like these promises to get paid back a little bit more money in the future, but not a whole lot. I took dinner usually at the Yale Club for some reason. It was the gloomiest event of my day. And then I went upstairs to the library and studied investments and securities for a conscientious hour. There were generally a few rioters around, but they never came into the library, so it was a good place to work. After that, if the night was mellow, I strolled down Madison Avenue past the old Murray Hill Hotel and over 33rd Street to the Pennsylvania Station. I began to like New York, the racy, adventurous feel of it at night, and the satisfaction that the constant flicker of men and women and machines gives to the restless eye. It's a very good description of New York, which is very much like a city that's very much alive. I liked to walk up Fifth Avenue and pick out romantic women from the crowd and imagine that in a few minutes I was going to enter into their lives and no one would ever know or disapprove. And we've got this idea of kind of like a hopeful future, right? We've got Nick hoping, but again, being passive. He's just dreaming about it. He's not doing anything to accomplish his dream, right? Sometimes in my mind, I followed them to their apartments on the corners of hidden streets, and they turned and smiled back at me before they faded through the door into warm darkness. At the enchanted metropolitan twilight, I felt a haunting loneliness sometimes, and felt it in others. Poor young clerks who loitered in front of windows, waiting until it was time for a solitary restaurant dinner. Young clerks in the dusk, wasting the most poignant moment of night and life. Again at 8 o'clock, when the dark lanes of the 40s were 5 deep, with throbbing taxicabs bound for the theater district, I felt a sinking in my heart. Forms leaned together in the taxis as they waited, and voices sang, and there was laughter from unheard jokes, and lighted cigarettes outlined unintelligible gestures inside. Imagining that I, too, was hurrying toward gaiety and sharing their intimate excitement, I wished them well. And now we've got, again, Nick, who is very much alone and wanting a romantic partner, right? He sees like these people, these couples in taxis, and he's like, I want to be like that.
Yeah, that's I actually made a note of that too. Like that's like Nick is lonely. He even says it
a couple of times.
Yeah, and then what is the gloomiest part of his day? When he goes to eat dinner. For some reason, it was the gloomiest event of my day. His only interaction is when he goes to work, and then he eats alone, and then he watches everyone go have fun in their life and all that. For me, I wrote down, it's like we just had this huge party, and this is like the hangover of the chapter. Like he's just alone, and it's kind of like depressing the next day, you know?
Very much so.
So I just thought that was like I don't know if that's on purpose, but
I think that's probably very much on purpose. It's very much like the hangover of the previous chapter, and it also mimics how chapter 1 and 2 went, which was chapter 1 kind of outlines how Daisy and Tom's rich and luxurious life is, and then chapter 2 is the Valley of Ashes, right? So it's like constantly juxtaposing. For a while, I lost sight of Jordan Baker, and then, in midsummer, I found her again. At first, I was flattered to go places with her because she was a golf champion, and everyone knew her name. Then it was something more. I wasn't actually in love, but I felt sort of tender curiosity. The bored, haughty face that she turned to the world concealed something. Most affections conceal something eventually, even though they don't in the beginning. And one day I found what it was. When we were on a house party together up in Warwick, she left a borrowed car out in the rain with the top down and then lied about it. And suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me that night at Daisy's. At her first big golf tournament, there was a row. There was a row that nearly reached the newspapers. A suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie in the semifinal round. The thing approached the proportions of a scandal, then died away. A caddy retracted his statement, and the only other witness admitted he might have been mistaken. The incident and the name had remained together in my mind. Jordan Baker instinctively avoided clever, shrewd men, and now I saw that this was because she felt safer on a plane where any divergence from a code would be thought impossible. She was incurably dishonest. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing in subterfuges, when she was very young in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world and yet satisfy the demands of her hard, jaunty body. And so we've got this very interesting story of how she was known for a bit for potentially cheating in one of her big golf tournaments, right? And something happened and it went away. And then we've got Nick describing her as being very, very dishonest, right? And that she doesn't hang around with clever people or clever men because she doesn't want to be found out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Very,
I think
unflattering.
Something else to talk about, a good study tip, subterfuges. I had to look that up yesterday. It's just like deception, but I think you said you tell them to do that, right? Like if you don't know a word, stop and look it up. If you can't understand it from the context. I knew kind of what it meant, but I just wanted to know exactly. So
if you watch a lot of spy movies, then you'll become familiar with the word subterfuge. Yeah. It made no difference to me. Dishonesty in a woman is a thing you never blame deeply. I was casually sorry, and then I forgot. It was on the same house party that we had a curious conversation about driving a car. It started because she passed so close to some workmen that our offender flicked a button on one man's coat. So they're driving, and she basically almost hit these guys. And how does he describe it? They had a curious conversation about driving a car, right? You're a rotten driver, I protested. Either you ought to be more careful or you oughtn't drive at all. I am careful. No, you're not. Well, other people are, she said lightly. What's that got to do with it? They'll keep out of my way, she insisted. It takes two to make an accident. Suppose you met somebody that just as careless as yourself. I hope I never will, she answered. I hate careless people. That's why I like you. It's such like a rich person thing to say, right? He's like, you're not a good driver, and she's like, yes, I am, and he's like, no, you're clearly not. And she's like, well, that's okay. Other people will handle this problem for me. Yeah. I don't have to worry about it.
Safety is not part of driving. Just getting from one point to another is.
Yeah, and it takes two to make an accident. No, it doesn't. Definitely only takes one person to make an accident. Yeah. Sometimes it takes two, but definitely does not take two people to hit somebody with a car.
She's taking no responsibility.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, right? She takes no responsibility whatsoever, right? And so we've got Fitzgerald painting this picture of the people who have made it in America as taking no responsibility for their actions, no character. And then why does she like Nick? She likes Nick because he's not careless. Her gray suntanned eyes, interesting that her eyes are gray, as if she's like dead inside. Her gray sun-stained eyes stared straight ahead, but she had deliberately shifted our relations. And for a moment I thought I loved her. But I am now slow thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires. And I knew that first I had to get myself definitely out of that tangle back home. I'd been writing letters once a week and signing them, Love Nick. And all I could think of was how, when that certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Nevertheless, there was a vague understanding that had to be tactfully broken off before I was free. Everyone suspects himself of at least one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I am one of the few honest people that I have ever known. And so he's like, I'm not going to make a move on Daisy or on Jordan until I have broken off this relationship I have back home.
So when I was reading this, is he talking? So he's signing the letters, Love Nick, and he says a certain girl with a faint mustache, perspiration. So he's fantasizing about this. Is it the girl or is it Jordan that he's talking about?
So he's saying that every time he signs Love Nick, in his mind, all he's thinking about is Jordan.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. I don't know how he can see the perspiration of her upper lip when she's playing tennis.
Because he's so infatuated with her that he's noticing little things about her that he's attracted to.
I just mean practically very hard to see that.
From across the court.
Yeah.